Picture this. The year is 1477, and in a cold stone chamber somewhere in the Low Countries, two young people are about to change the course of European history forever, not through conquest or bloodshed, but through something far more subtle and infinitely more powerful, a marriage contract. The groom is Maximilian of Habsburg, a relatively unknown Austrian noble whose family castle sits modestly in what we now call Switzerland. The bride is Mary of Burgundy, one of the richest heiresses in all of Europe. Neither of them could have imagined that this single union would launch their descendants toward an empire where, quite literally, the sun would never set. But let's step back further to understand how this moment came to be. In the misty valleys of medieval Switzerland, around the year 1020, a minor noble family built a fortress on a rocky outcrop overlooking the Aire River. They called it Habsburg Castle, Hawk's Castle, after the bird of prey that soared above its towers. For centuries, these Habsburgs were nobodies in the grand scheme of European politics. While kings and emperors waged great wars and carved up continents, the Habsburgs tended their modest lands and dreamed of something greater. What they possessed, however, was something more valuable than armies or gold. They had an almost supernatural gift for strategic marriages. While other nobles drew their swords to expand their territories, the Habsburgs drew up marriage contracts. They understood, perhaps better than anyone else in medieval Europe, that a well-chosen bride could accomplish what 1,000 soldiers could not. This philosophy would eventually be captured in the famous saying, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." When Maximilian took Mary's hand in 1477, he wasn't just gaining a wife, he was inheriting the vast Burgundian territories that stretched from the Netherlands down through eastern France. Suddenly, these minor Swiss nobles found themselves controlling some of the wealthiest trading cities in Europe. The marriage was like lightning striking twice in the same place, transforming the Habsburgs from regional players into continental powers virtually overnight. But this was only the beginning. The real masterstroke came a generation later, when their descendants arranged another brilliant match that would make the Burgundian inheritance look modest by comparison. Through a complex web of marriages and deaths, the Habsburg bloodline merged with that of the Spanish royal family. When a young man named Charles, later known as Charles V, inherited both his Austrian grandfather's lands and his Spanish grandmother's kingdom in the early 1500s, the Habsburg dominion became truly global for the first time in human history. Imagine Charles V standing in his palace in Brussels, maps spread across enormous oak tables, trying to comprehend the sheer scope of what he ruled. His territory stretched from the icy fjords of Norway to the tropical plantations of the Caribbean. Spanish conquistadors were claiming entire continents in his name, while Austrian administrators governed ancient kingdoms in the heart of Europe. Silver from the mines of Peru flowed into his treasury, while spices from the Philippines seasoned the tables of his courtiers. It was an empire unlike anything the world had ever seen, not built through systematic conquest like Rome, but assembled piece by piece through centuries of careful matrimonial diplomacy. Yet managing such an vast and diverse empire proved almost impossible for one man, even one as capable as Charles V. The logistics alone were staggering. A message from Madrid to Vienna could take weeks to arrive, and by the time orders reached the New World, the situations they addressed had often changed completely. Charles found himself constantly traveling, trying to hold together an empire that threatened to fly apart at any moment. He spent his life in carriages and on horseback, moving from crisis to crisis, never quite able to rest or feel secure in his accomplishments. By the 1550s, the burden had become unbearable. In one of the most remarkable decisions in European history, Charles chose to divide his empire between his son Philip and his brother Ferdinand. Philip would inherit Spain and its global territories, the Americas, the Philippines, parts of Italy, and the Netherlands. Ferdinand would receive the Austrian lands and, more importantly, the ancient title of Holy Roman Emperor. This split would define European politics for centuries to come, creating two separate Habsburg dynasties that would sometimes cooperate and sometimes compete, but would always remain bound by blood and shared ambition. The Austrian Habsburgs, now centered in Vienna, faced challenges that were no less daunting than those of their Spanish cousins. The Holy Roman Empire was not really an empire in any modern sense. It was more like a loose confederation of hundreds of semi-independent duchies, principalities, and free cities, each jealously guarding its own privileges and traditions. Governing this patchwork required skills that were part diplomat, part accountant, and part fortune-teller. The Habsburgs had to constantly negotiate, cajole, and compromise just to maintain their nominal authority over lands that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean. But perhaps their greatest challenge came from the east, where the Ottoman Empire was expanding relentlessly into the heart of Europe. The Ottomans were everything the Holy Roman Empire was not: unified, disciplined, and driven by a clear sense of mission. When Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent led his massive army to the gates of Vienna in 1529, it seemed possible that Christian Europe might be swept away entirely. The siege lasted only a few weeks, but it transformed how Europeans saw themselves and their place in the world. Vienna became a symbol, the last bastion of Christendom, the point where East met West in a struggle that would define the next several centuries. The Habsburgs embraced this role as defenders of Christian Europe with remarkable skill. They turned their military struggles against the Ottomans into a powerful propaganda tool, portraying themselves not just as rulers, but as the chosen champions of the faith. When the Ottomans returned to Vienna in 1683 with an even larger army, the city's defense became a truly international effort. Polish cavalry, Austrian infantry, and troops from across the Holy Roman Empire united under Habsburg leadership to break the siege in one of the most dramatic military victories in European history. But wars, even victorious ones, are expensive. The constant fighting against the Ottomans, combined with the need to maintain order across the fractured Holy Roman Empire, drained the Habsburg treasury and tested the patience of their subjects. By the early 1600s, religious tensions that had been simmering since the Protestant Reformation finally boiled over into open warfare. The 30 Years' War, which began in 1618, would prove to be one of the most devastating conflicts in European history. It started, almost comically, with an incident in Prague Castle known as the Defenestration of Prague. Protestant nobles, angry at the policies of the Catholic Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand II, literally threw 2 imperial officials out of a 3rd-story window. The men survived, some said by divine intervention. Others suggested they landed in a conveniently placed pile of manure, but the incident sparked a rebellion that quickly spread across the entire Holy Roman Empire. What followed was 30 years of almost continuous warfare that devastated Central Europe. Armies crisscrossed the landscape like locusts, destroying crops, burning villages, and spreading disease. The population of some German states fell by half. Entire regions were depopulated, their survivors fleeing to whatever safety they could find. Yet, through it all, the Habsburgs managed to maintain their hold on power, adapting their strategies as needed, and emerging from the conflict, still nominally in control of the Holy Roman Empire. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 officially ended the war, but it also marked a fundamental shift in European politics. The old medieval notion of universal empire, the idea that one ruler could legitimately claim authority over all of Christendom, was finally and definitively abandoned. Instead, the treaty established the principle of state sovereignty, the idea that individual nations had the right to govern themselves without outside interference. For the Habsburgs, this meant that while they retained the title of Holy Roman Emperor, their actual power over the empire's constituent states was greatly reduced. Recognizing these new realities, the Habsburgs began to focus more intensively on consolidating their power in their hereditary lands, Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary. This shift would prove crucial to their long-term survival. Rather than trying to impose their will on hundreds of semi-independent German principalities, they concentrated on building a more centralized, efficient state in the territories they could actually control. This transformation became particularly evident during the reign of Maria Theresa, who inherited the Habsburg lands in 1740 under circumstances that would have daunted even the most experienced ruler. She was just 23 years old, had never been trained for leadership. Her father had expected her to marry some foreign prince and live quietly, and faced immediate challenges from enemies who saw her youth and gender as weaknesses to be exploited. Frederick the Great of Prussia struck first, invading and seizing the wealthy province of Silesia, before Maria Theresa had even properly established her authority. Other European powers, sensing opportunity, began to circle like vultures. The War of Austrian Succession that followed would last 8 years and test every aspect of Maria Theresa's character and capabilities. But Maria Theresa was no ordinary 23-year-old. She possessed a remarkable combination of political intelligence, personal charisma, and sheer determination that allowed her not just to survive these early challenges, but to emerge from them stronger than before. When she traveled to Hungary to plead for support from the Hungarian nobles, she appeared before them holding her infant son, dressed in mourning clothes, and delivered a speech that was said to have moved the entire assembly to tears. The Hungarian magnates rose as one and declared, over the following decades, Maria Theresa transformed the Habsburg state. She modernized the military, reformed the tax system, improved education, and created a more efficient bureaucracy. She bore 16 children, including the future Queen Marie Antoinette of France, while simultaneously governing one of Europe's most complex empires. Her reign demonstrated that the Habsburg genius for adaptation was not limited to men or to military matters. It extended to every aspect of statecraft and could be exercised with equal skill by a woman who had never expected to rule. Maria Theresa's son, Joseph II, represented the Habsburg dynasty at perhaps its most idealistic. Deeply influenced by Enlightenment philosophy, Joseph attempted to create a rational, progressive state based on principles of equality and human dignity. He abolished serfdom, granted religious toleration to Protestants and Jews, and tried to reform everything from the legal system to the organization of the Catholic Church. His reforms were breathtaking in their scope and ambition. Imagine the shock of conservative nobles when they learned that their serfs, people they had always considered little better than property, were now free to leave the land, marry whom they chose, and even bring legal complaints against their former masters. Picture the astonishment of Jewish communities when they discovered they could now worship openly, attend universities, and enter professions that had been closed to them for centuries. But Joseph's reforms were also deeply disruptive. He moved too fast, consulted too little, and underestimated how difficult it would be to change centuries-old traditions overnight. Revolts broke out in Hungary and the Austrian Netherlands. The Catholic Church resisted his efforts to reduce its influence. Even many of the people his reforms were meant to help found themselves confused and frightened by the pace of change. When Joseph died in 1790, much of his reform program was abandoned or reversed by his successors. Yet his reign had demonstrated both the potential and the limits of enlightened monarchy. The Habsburgs were capable of remarkable adaptation and innovation, but they were still constrained by the realities of governing a diverse, traditional society that was not always ready for progress. These limitations became even more apparent when the French Revolution erupted across their western border. The execution of Marie Antoinette, Maria Theresa's daughter, in 1793, shocked the Habsburg family personally and convinced them that revolutionary ideas posed an existential threat to the entire European order. For the next 25 years, the Habsburgs would find themselves almost constantly at war with first revolutionary France and then Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was unlike any enemy the Habsburgs had ever faced. He combined the military genius of history's greatest conquerors with the ideological fervor of the French Revolution and the administrative efficiency of a modern state. His armies moved faster, fought harder, and adapted more quickly than anything Europe had seen before. When Napoleon crushed the combined Austrian and Russian forces at Austerlitz in 1805, he didn't just win a battle. He demonstrated that the old European order was obsolete. The defeat at Austerlitz forced the Habsburgs to make one of the most painful decisions in their long history. In 1806, Emperor Francis II formally dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, ending an institution that had existed for over 800 years. The title that had connected the Habsburgs to Charlemagne, to the medieval notion of universal Christian empire, to centuries of European tradition, was abandoned forever. Yet even this seemingly devastating blow became, in typical Habsburg fashion, an opportunity for renewal. By creating the Austrian Empire in 1804, 2 years before dissolving the Holy Roman Empire, Francis had already begun the process of transformation. The new empire was more centralized, more efficient, and more unified than the old Holy Roman Empire had ever been. It represented not the end of Habsburg power, but its evolution into something more suited to the modern world. The Vienna Congress of 1815, which met after Napoleon's final defeat, saw the Habsburgs at perhaps the height of their diplomatic influence. Led by the brilliant Chancellor Metternich, Austria played a crucial role in reshaping post-Napoleonic Europe. Metternich understood that the Habsburgs could no longer dominate through military might alone. Instead, they would have to lead through diplomacy, balance of power politics, and careful management of the European state system. For nearly 30 years, Metternich's system kept Europe at peace. The Concert of Europe, which brought the major powers together for regular consultations, prevented small disputes from escalating into continent-wide wars. Austria became the coordinator of European conservatism, the power that other monarchies looked to for leadership in resisting liberal and nationalist movements. But beneath this apparent stability, powerful forces were building that would eventually overwhelm even Metternich's diplomatic genius. The year 1848 brought revolutions across Europe, and the Austrian Empire found itself fighting for its very survival. In Vienna, students and workers took to the streets demanding constitutional government and civil liberties. In Hungary, Louis Kossuth led a nationalist uprising that declared complete independence from Austrian rule. In Prague, Czech patriots demanded recognition of their national rights. In Milan and Venice, Italian revolutionaries drove out Austrian administrators and proclaimed their freedom. For a few terrifying months, it seemed possible that the entire Habsburg edifice might collapse. Metternich himself fled to England in disguise, abandoning the capital as revolutionary crowds filled the streets. The young Emperor Franz Joseph, who had just ascended to the throne at age 18, faced challenges that would have broken many experienced rulers. But once again, the Habsburg capacity for survival asserted itself. Franz Joseph, working with conservative generals and administrators who had remained loyal, methodically crushed the various revolts. The Hungarian rebellion was suppressed with help from Russian troops. Czech nationalism was contained through a combination of concessions and repression. Italian revolutionaries were defeated and Austrian control restored. Yet Franz Joseph understood that simple military victory was not enough. The revolutions of 1848 had revealed that the empire's traditional system of centralized rule could no longer contain the growing forces of nationalism. Something had to change, or the empire would face even more serious challenges in the future. The solution came in 1867 with the Austro-Hungarian Compromise, one of the most creative political arrangements in European history. Rather than trying to suppress Hungarian nationalism, Franz Joseph chose to accommodate it by transforming the Austrian Empire into a dual monarchy. Hungary would govern itself domestically while remaining united with Austria for purposes of foreign policy and defense. It was a brilliant compromise that satisfied Hungarian demands for autonomy while preserving Habsburg unity. The Austro-Hungarian Empire that emerged from this arrangement was unlike anything else in Europe. It was simultaneously one state and two states, unified and divided, traditional and modern. Vienna remained the imperial capital, but Budapest became a co-equal center of power. German and Hungarian were both official languages, but dozens of other languages were spoken throughout the empire's territories. This diversity was both the empire's greatest strength and its most persistent weakness. At its best, the dual monarchy represented a unique experiment in multinational governance, a place where different peoples could maintain their distinct identities while participating in a larger political and economic system. The great cities of the empire, Vienna, Budapest, Prague, Krakow, Lviv, became centers of remarkable cultural creativity. Writers like Franz Kafka, musicians like Gustav Mahler, scientists like Sigmund Freud, all flourished in this cosmopolitan environment where different traditions encountered and enriched each other. But the empire's diversity also created constant tensions. Czechs resented being governed from Vienna and demanded the same autonomy that had been granted to Hungary. Croats, Slovaks, Romanians, and other Slavic peoples felt marginalized by German and Hungarian dominance. As nationalism grew stronger throughout Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these internal divisions became increasingly difficult to manage. The final crisis began in the Balkans, where Austro-Hungarian territories bordered the independent Kingdom of Serbia. Serbian nationalism, supported by Russia, aimed to unite all South Slavs under Serbian leadership, a goal that directly threatened Austrian control over Bosnia-Herzegovina and other Slavic provinces. When Austro-Hungary annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina outright in 1908, it set off a chain of events that would ultimately lead to World War. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Bosnian Serb nationalist. The Archduke's death provided Austria-Hungary with the pretext it had long sought for settling accounts with Serbia once and for all. Backed by Germany's promise of unconditional support, Vienna issued an ultimatum to Belgrade that was designed to be rejected. When Serbia refused to accept all of Austria-Hungary's demands, the empire declared war. Russia mobilized to support Serbia, Germany declared war on Russia, France honored its alliance with Russia, and Britain entered the conflict when Germany invaded Belgium. Within weeks, a regional Balkan dispute had escalated into a global conflagration that would destroy the old European order forever. For Austria-Hungary, World War I was a catastrophe from beginning to end. The empire's multi-ethnic army, already weakened by divided loyalties, crumbled under the pressure of fighting on multiple fronts. Hundreds of thousands of Slavic soldiers deserted or surrendered to the Russians, whom they saw as liberators rather than enemies. Supply lines broke down, the economy collapsed, and civilian populations faced starvation and disease. By 1918, the empire was dissolving even before the war officially ended. Czechs and Slovaks declared the creation of Czechoslovakia. Poles proclaimed the restoration of an independent Poland. South Slavs formed Yugoslavia. Hungarians severed their ties with Austria and declared a separate republic. On November 11, 1918, Emperor Charles I, Franz Joseph's successor, issued a proclamation renouncing his participation in state affairs, though he stopped short of formal abdication. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had simply ceased to exist, not through conquest by foreign enemies, but through internal collapse as its constituent peoples chose to go their separate ways. The treaties of Saint-Germain and Trianon in 1919 and 1920 formally dismantled what remained of Habsburg power. Austria became a small, landlocked republic centered on Vienna, a great imperial capital now governing a nation of fewer than 7 million people. Hungary was reduced to less than a third of its former territory, with millions of ethnic Hungarians now living as minorities in neighboring countries. And so ended more than 6 centuries of Habsburg rule in Central Europe. The family that had risen from obscurity through strategic marriages, that had governed the Holy Roman Empire for centuries, that had defended Christian Europe against Ottoman expansion, that had created one of history's most successful multinational empires, finally succumbed to forces they could neither control nor adapt to quickly enough. Yet the Habsburg legacy lived on in ways both obvious and subtle. The cities they had ruled, Vienna, Prague, Budapest, Krakow, retained the architectural grandeur and cultural sophistication that Habsburg patronage had fostered. The legal systems, administrative practices, and educational institutions they had established continued to shape the successor states that emerged from their empire's ruins. Even the problems that plagued Central Europe throughout the 20th century, ethnic tensions, border disputes, economic underdevelopment, could often be traced back to the unresolved contradictions within the Habsburg system. Perhaps most importantly, the Habsburg example demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of multinational empire in the modern age. At their best, the Habsburgs showed that it was possible for different peoples to live together peacefully under common institutions while maintaining their distinct identities. At their worst, they revealed how quickly such arrangements could collapse when the forces of nationalism and democracy challenged traditional forms of authority. The story of the Habsburgs is ultimately a story about adaptation and survival, about how a minor noble family used intelligence, flexibility, and sheer persistence to remain at the center of European politics for more than 600 years. They survived the rise and fall of countless rivals, adapted to dramatic changes in military technology and political organization, and managed to reinvent themselves repeatedly as circumstances required. In the end, they fell not because they lacked these traditional strengths, but because the world changed faster than even they could adapt. The age of multinational empires was ending, replaced by an era of nation-states and popular sovereignty. The Habsburg system, for all its sophistication and longevity, could not survive this fundamental transformation in how Europeans understood political legitimacy and national identity. But perhaps that too was a kind of success. The Habsburgs had shaped European history for 6 centuries, longer than any other dynasty. They had created institutions, traditions, and cultural achievements that outlasted their political power. And they had demonstrated that even in a world increasingly dominated by force and nationalism, there was still room for diplomacy, compromise, and the patient art of holding diverse peoples together under common institutions. Their story reminds us that history is not just about the rise and fall of nations, but about the human capacity for both creation and destruction, for both adaptation and stubbornness, for both wisdom and folly. In the end, the Habsburgs were neither heroes nor villains, but something more complex and more human, survivors who shaped their world even as they were shaped by it, who left behind both achievements to be celebrated and failures to be mourned, and who remind us that even the mightiest of empires are, in the end, temporary creations of mortal human beings trying to make sense of an ever-changing world. Thank you for watching this historical journey through the Habsburg dynasty. If you found this content informative and engaging, please consider liking and subscribing to our channel for more historical documentaries.